Short barrels, 9mm versus 357 Magnum versus 45 ACP. What I have today is our Hornady American gunner ammunition. So I'm trying to make this test as fair as possible. So I went with everything that is considered standard pressure, but there was a plus P 9mm. And I've gotten a lot of flack for using plus P with other cartridges, so I decided to go with the standard pressure. So our 115 grain XTP for our 9mm. We have a 125 grain for our 357 Magnum and a 185 grain XTP for a 45. The 9mm and the 45 actually have identical sectional density, so that's pretty interesting. And the 357 is going to have a hair more, but you know, these are pretty much the only variants those come in. So I'm going to use my 3.2 inch Taurus G2C to test the 9mm, my 3.3 inch Smith & Wesson M&P Shield 45 to test the 45, and my Taurus 605 with a 2-inch barrel to test the 357 Magnum. These all have essentially identical barrel travel in those because, you know, you don't count the actual chamber. You do count the chamber and the barrel length there. You don't in the revolver, so it equals out to exactly the same amount of barrel travel. These guns all weigh about the same, so it should be a really interesting test. Our 9mm is rated at 1155 feet per second. Our 357 Magnum is rated at 1500, and our 45 ACP is rated at 970 feet per second. So we'll go through the chronograph, see what kind of velocity and accuracy we get at the same time. Then I'm going to do my 10% clear ballistic gel test. So I'm going to go into plain 10% clear ballistics to see what the best potential of those cartridges are. No fabric or anything like that in the way that could potentially clog a hollow point. And hopefully we can see our best potential of those for getting like hollow point expansion. Then I'm going to move on to doing more of a real world simulation where I'm going to have 4 layers of sweatshirt material on this first 3-inch piece that represents hitting a pectoral muscle, followed by a 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard that represents hitting ribs or sternum, 16 more inches of clear ballistics, and another 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard at the back to represent hitting back ribs. Clear ballistics is roughly a half representation of the density of flesh, so 3 inches is really like 1.5 inches in real flesh, and 16 inches is more like 8 inches. So this is really more like representing about a 9.5 inch thick individual with ribs on the front and back. So if we stay within that first gel block there in a real world simulation, that will be considered probably a success. So we'll do a plain clear ballistic shot, then a real world simulation shot, and then I will shoot at the steel target to see what kind of practical accuracy and shootability I can get with these. So let's get started with this test. All right, first up we have our 9mm 115 grain XTP. This is rated at 1155 feet per second. I believe that's through a 4-inch barrel. So let's see how close we get to 1155 on my 3.2 inch barrel here. $1,049, $1,059, $1,047, $1,046, $1,052. So that's about what you might expect. Our 45 ACP 185 grain XTP. This is rated at 970 feet per second, likely through a 5-inch barrel. Let's see how close I get to 970 and my Shield 45 here. 812, 830, 787, 819, 791. So that's pretty terrible because most of the standard pressure 230 grain rounds I test through this are right at about an even 800 feet per second. So that's pretty weak. That's pretty pitiful. Now our 357 Magnum. This is actually rated at 1,500 feet per second, I believe, through an 8-inch barrel. Typical 125 grain rounds out of this 2-inch barrel, out of any 2-inch barrel, are generally 1,200 to 1,250 feet per second for an average 357 Magnum round. So let's see how close we get to 1,200 to 1,250 out of my little snub here. 1308, 1186. That's terrible consistency. 1235, 1257, 1250. So other than that one, every shot was very powerful. Every shot was painful to shoot. This is a beast of a round, to be honest. It's one of those things where it's like, if you were to shoot through a 4-inch barrel, it wouldn't be that powerful. but because it's like a cheap, fast-burning powder, when you put it in a short barrel, it actually retains more energy than typical. So that's a very powerful 357 Magnum for sure. So let's hit our ballistics gel block and see how these all compare. All right, first up we'll do our plain clear ballistic shot, so no fabric in the way that could potentially clog the hollow points and prevent expansion. No rib simulation that could potentially slow down its penetration. So let's see if we get here with our 9mm into plain clear ballistics. All right, that's in there. Now, let's try our 45 ACP. All right. And our 357 Magnum. Let's go take a look. All right, so a big difference there. We can see a lot of tumbling damage and bubbling with that 9mm for sure. That's what you see when it's possibly not expanding. I have no idea if it's expanded because I can't see through that. Here's our first 3-inch piece, our energy dump. A little bit with our 9mm, a tad more with our 45, and a lot more with our 357 Magnum. So I cannot tell if our 9mm has expansion or does not, just because I can't see through that gel the way that bubbling is. But we went to about 18¼ inches with our 9mm. So with our 45 ACP, definitely more energy dump starting in this block than the 9mm. Not a lot more, but a little bit more. And we went to a total penetration of about I'm going to say 19¼ inches, so not that deep, to be honest. And our 357 Magnum, huge amount of energy dump entering the main block, huge amount of energy dump still. Just way better performance overall. And what we got with that is about 15½ inches of penetration, so big difference there overall. Let's put on our fabric, put in our rib simulation, and see how these do in our real world simulation. All right, our real world simulation, 4 layers of sweatshirt material, followed by 3 inches of clear ballistics that represents hitting a pectoral muscle, followed by a 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard that represents hitting ribs or sternum, 16 more inches of clear ballistics, then another 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard at the back to represent hitting back ribs. Let's see how our 9mm does. I knew this was going to happen. Let's do it one more time. All right. Now let's hit that with our 45 ACP. And see how that does. And our 357 Magnum. Let's go take a look. So yeah, I just knew I was gonna get one of those bullets to go under the block. It always does when I'm trying to do 3 on each side of these blocks. It always pans out that way. So our first 9mm, our second 9mm, our 45, and our 357 Magnum. So it does appear our 357 and our 9mm are expanding out right away, but it looks like our 45 ACP has a little bit of trouble at that velocity of only 800 feet per second of getting expansion. So, you know, and this valid one with our 9mm, a little bit of energy dump, our 45 a little bit less, and our 357 a little bit more than our 9mm. So it's hard to see the quality of the expansion with that 9mm, but it looks like it went to about 18.5 inches. So good penetration, and I think it expanded. Now our 45, I can look at it right now, I can tell it's not expanded. So that fabric caused some issue with that 45 expanding. And that went to about 17.25 inches of penetration. So didn't over penetrate because it was moving so slowly, but it didn't expand either. And our 357 Magnum did fantastic. And we went to about call it 17.25 inches with some good expansion. So, you know, our 9mm did okay for what it is. Our 45, I guess our 45 failed, but at the same time, because it's a bigger bolt to start with, it kind of evened out to almost doing as well as the 9mm. You know, not on a technical scale. You know, it didn't get expansion, but what I mean is, you know, the bolt's already bigger, didn't penetrate that far, didn't over penetrate, and it still caused pretty much the same damage as that 9mm. So in a real world setting, I'm gonna say those are pretty similar, to be honest. Now 357 mag obviously did better. We got more tearing, more striation cuts, more damage, just everything about it. It looks a lot better. But the takeaway from that is a lot more recoil. So we'll see if I can control these, see if that makes a huge difference. So let me shoot the steel target, but first let's pull these out of the block, take a close-up look at these bullets. All right, so here's a close-up look at these bullets going through plain gel. Here's our 9mm, here's our 45 ACP, and here is our 357 Magnum. So our 9mm did okay for what it is. You know, we got some good expansion for being an XTP, so that's not bad performance overall, if I'm going to be completely honest. It's okay. I would use that. Our 45 ACP, kind of a weird expansion going through plain gel, but you know, at such low velocities, yeah, I could see why that would happen. It's kind of like the nose expanded, but you know, the peeling back, making it larger and larger is kind of limited there. And then our 357 Magnum, a lot more expansion than the 9mm. You know, and this started out essentially the same diameter as the 9mm, and we can see that, you know, extra velocity makes a big difference there, because it got a lot bigger overall from that extra velocity there. So not terrible performance going through plain gel. Now our real world simulation, everything changes up. Here's our 9mm, our 45, and our 357 Magnum. So kind of the same order. This, you know, didn't do quite as good as the 357. All of them are smaller than what they were through plain gel, and our 45 just didn't even start to get that expansion. So our 9mm, just a hair smaller than going through plain gel, but not bad, pretty good. Our 45, now here's the thing, like I said about in the real world type of thing, yes, this didn't do that well, but if you actually look at the back of that 45 caliber bullet compared to that expanded 9mm, which one looks like it potentially bigger overall, you know? So while this failed more than this one, in reality this would likely do as well as that. And then our biggest expansion is our 357 Magnum. You know, bigger than the 9mm, yeah, even though they started out about the same. Say our 357 is about as big as, it's actually bigger than the 9mm going through plain gel. So clear winner here, stands right out as our 357 Magnum. Just had better terminal performance, but the recoil is quite high. Our 9mm did pretty good overall. Our 45, you know, technically less than the 9mm for performance, but I'm going to say I think it would do as well in the real world as the 9mm. But a 357 Magnum did the best here. So that's a close-up look at those bullets. All right, so I'm going to do our practical shootability drill. I am 14 yards from the target, and we'll just see how these things will do. So our 9mm, I'm going to put a bunch of rounds on target, and then we'll move on to our 45, and then see if our 357 Magnum becomes impossible to land shots. So here's our 9mm. That's kind of the drill that most people do with 9mm. You know, they say got a lot of shots, and that's the benefit. So less shots with our 45. See how this does. Less shots, but theoretically possibly more effective. 357 Magnum, handful to shoot, but let's see how this does for me. So just popping them off. A lot of blasts going on there. Definitely harder to control, but my gut feeling tells me that if you were to land one of these, it's going to be way more effective than one round of 9mm. It's just so loud, it's hitting so fast, does a lot of damage. So I could see the trade-off with this versus the 9mm. Not sure I see it with the 45 with this ammo, but let me back it up and shoot from a little more distance for fun. All right, 40 yards from the target, our Dick and drill distance. I think it's worth noting that, you know, when I do those 14-yard drills there, I'm actually not lining up the sights. I'm barely getting a glimpse of my front sight and then just using muscle memory from there. So I've just kind of thrown those shots. I'm not really going for groups, but back here at 40 yards, I am going to go for groups a little bit. So I'm going to line up the back sights and fire a little bit slower. So 40 yards from the target, here's our 9mm. All right, so that's very easy to shoot. Not bad performance overall for, you know, accuracy and all that. 45 ACP. Let's see how this does. I don't know where that went. Don't know where that went. So I'm not really sure where they were going because I can't tell exactly which hit is from what caliber, but it was like the first few hits I was aiming center mass perfectly fine, and then I just kind of took a chance and aimed a little bit high and a little bit left, and then I started hearing the steel. So that ammo is just not wanting to shoot to the right point of aim for me, so that's worth noting. Now our 357 Magnum. See how this does for me. Started slipping on the ice there. So our 9mm and our 357 Magnum, I would say, are equal in accuracy, because obviously that miss at the 357's on me if most of them are hitting, and when you start seeing that big old muzzle jump and you bring it back down, you get a little bit of flinch going on there with something that recoils that much. And I'll be honest, it has a lot of recoil for what it is. So looking at this overall, our 357 Magnum hands down is the winner for terminal ballistics with this ammo. So I can't stress that enough. This ammo. So cheap XTP rounds moving at these velocities. You know, the 9mm was fine, but it's kind of meh. It's okay, but I didn't really see anything that stood out as performing particularly well. As where the 357 Magnum, we're seeing ballistic, terminal ballistic performance that's like good, really good. So I would want that if I was going to use one of these to defend myself with. That being said, you know, you could probably land twice as many rounds with a 9mm, and with a round that's probably half as effective, it kind of equals out a little bit there. Our 45 and this ammo, terrible. You could do a lot better. So that's why I say I can't stress this enough, because in this test, our 357 did the best. Our 9mm is kind of tied in a way. So that did the best along with the 357, because you know what you don't get in terminal performance, you make up for a little bit in capacity and shootability. As where our 45, that was easy to shoot, but the performance was terrible. But then you could switch to a different ammo, and you could have, like, you're maxing out the power of a 9mm out of a short barrel or a 45. I've seen 45s that easily just one after the other go over 400 foot-pounds of energy and expand. As where 9mm out of this short of a barrel, they're generally 350, 360 foot-pounds. So with kind of more comparable, better ammo, our 45 generally does a little bit better. But in this test, when we're just kind of loading kind of low quality ammo, our 9mm does a little bit better, because that extra velocity really helps out with bullets like this. And then when we see with the 357 Magnum, it really helps out with extra velocity to get good performance with a basic bullet like an XTP. So in this test, our 357 and our 9mm did pretty well, our 45 not so much. So that's what you get today. So as always, comment, share, and like, and thanks for watching.